It's Wednesday, February 12th, and this is the 1909, the State News' weekly podcast featuring our reporters talking about the news. I'm your host, Alex Walters. This week, Michigan State's precarious politicking continues. Despite federal attacks, university leaders are doubling down on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and guiding faculty on how to protect undocumented students. They're also striking deals with constituencies closer to home, giving a new post to a controversial former dean, and once again negotiating with persistent protesters on the divestment issue. Here to talk about it are our new administration reporters, or one new, one old administration reporters. Emilio, Owen, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Alex.
You guys covered a crazy week last week of Michigan State, both in these sort of local issues and responding to federal issues, trying to maintain a balance amid what are some threats from protesters, federal actors. This is a dangerous environment for universities. They're having a hard time navigating it, and MSU seems to be walking a careful line. Tell me, Owen, an illustrative scene of the kind of thing that MSU is dealing with these days. You covered a board meeting last week. After all of this talk of DEI, there's executive orders, there are changes in the federal government, and this was addressed head on. Tell me about what is this DEI issue that MSU's been facing, and what did they say about it at this kind of pivotal meeting?
Yeah, exactly. So diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and measures, kind of from the outset of Donald Trump's presidential campaign, was something that he kind of wanted to go after. And so right when he takes office, one of the first actions he takes, actually, was an executive order that was ending all DEI programs in the federal government, right? Narrowly the federal government. But that move was sort of seen largely as a signal of what's to come next, right? And so, yes, this one's specifically about the federal government, but more stuff is coming, right? Sure enough, more stuff did come. Emilio did a story shortly after that based on another executive order, which was Trump was essentially asking federal agencies to find him 9 potential civil compliance investigations into corporations, universities with endowments over $1 billion, which MSU would fit, basically asking them to look for investigations into these places who aren't really adhering to who aren't in compliance with the DEI sort of crackdown. And
we've talked about this in the show before, but basically saying pretty openly, like, I don't know exactly what enforcement mechanism I have to make universities stop doing this DEI stuff, but I'm going to order my people in my cabinet to get out there and find me, a stick I can use to kind of like beat this DEI stuff out of these universities I don't have direct control over. Yeah,
exactly. And so MSU at that point sort of became a potential target because they do fit that category of an endowment over $1 billion. And so then after that, you start seeing these instances where MSU has these events scheduled. The first was a Future of DEI Policy at MSU panel discussion. And this was going to have MSU's chief diversity officer, administrator sort of talking about what the ramifications of executive orders like that might be. They had this scheduled, and then kind of a week before it was supposed to happen, they canceled it. And they cited sort of uncertainty and concerns over the executive orders, though they said that really what the intent was to kind of make sure they had long enough to kind of look over these things and review them so that they could articulate it as best as possible, right? And then after that, there was a Lunar New Year cultural event that was also canceled, kind of citing the same reasons. But that was sort of met with an immediate kind of backlash across campus as an example of sort of complying in advance to some of these DEI orders. And kind of the reaction was, I'm pretty sure we could have had the Lunar New Year event and been okay, even though there's this sort of hostility from the Trump administration. But of course, when they canceled it, they sort of cited concerns from students. And we still haven't gotten a ton of clarity as far as who those students were, how many there were.
So what did they say? Board meeting last week, all the university's leaders together in one room. You wrote a story about the things they said about DEI. They've canceled these events. They're subject of these executive orders. They kind of set the tone and like, okay, going forward, this is how we want to handle this DEI stuff that is now under so much threat.
Yeah, exactly. So after all, these weeks of sort of uncertainty around this, and even some questions about to what extent is MSU committed to DEI, given the cancellation of the events, the very first thing President Kevin Guskiewicz says when he starts his president's report right at the start is, Well, he says, I want to wish everyone a happy new year, and to those that celebrated a happy lunar new year, which obviously kind of takes on a new significance given the cancellation of the event. And then right after that, he says, our international students and scholars bring with them such diverse traditions and add so much to our cultural tapestry here at MSU. He then goes on to congratulate recent recipients of MSU's Excellence in DEI awards. And then he specifically said we're experiencing a changing federal landscape here, referring to Trump, but said that, in the midst of all that, for him, when I asked him in the presser afterwards, after the meeting, he said, what I've been consistent in saying is that it won't be a choice here. We will be an inclusive community and one that will always aspire toward the equity part. Yeah. And then we heard similar sentiments from board members. In fact, I would say there was a sort of consensus at this meeting that DEI is something that matters to MSU as an institution.
And then what about, Emilio, DEI, it seems like there are these threats federally, MSU cancels these events, but now MSU's backtracking this cancellation, saying, no, we are committed to this DEI stuff. What about the immigration issue? Because this is something that Trump has tried to go after, affecting directly college students who are undocumented. And MSU in the past, I guess the university and the surrounding city of East Lansing have been on these lists of sanctuary cities that are trying to be accommodating to undocumented people that federal immigration law enforcement might be trying to deport under Trump. Tell me about what is Trump doing that would have people worried who are undocumented on campus, and what has MSU said to faculty in this guidance that you reported on about what faculty are supposed to do and what administrators are supposed to do amid all of this?
Yeah, so absolutely. Throughout the campaign, right, Trump kind of campaigned on this idea that he was going to do this largest deportation operation in U.S. history, right, and that he was going to mobilize ICE to really go after a lot of undocumented people in the U.S. And then, on the first, I think it was the second day of his administration, the Department of Homeland Security, which is responsible for running ICE, rescinds these guidelines, these Biden-era guidelines that have sort of, like you said, placed college campuses in a sort of protected area status. In which ICE couldn't really operate without further permission from either their higher-ups or the Department of Homeland Security. And so this really has opened up college campuses to have ICE on their campuses in a way that they hadn't really had to worry about beforehand.
So there aren't federal rules protecting MSU anymore from
exactly.
ICE coming on campus.
MSU is essentially treated like any other public space now. And so, MSU, when we have these conversations about what MSU can do, it's important to note that because federal law enforcement just has more jurisdiction over the country, they don't need to ask permission, for example, to come on to a university campus. They don't need to ask MSU. And so when we talk about things like MSU being a sanctuary campus or East Lansing being a sanctuary campus or city, usually what that means is that either MSU police or East Lansing police have a sort of condition where they won't cooperate with federal law enforcement trying to detain people solely for their immigration status.
And I've also seen stuff about MSU's policies that almost the same way that medical amnesty would protect your interactions with a hospital if you're doing drugs that are illegal. If you have some sort of illegal immigration status, you're undocumented, MSU police has essentially said if you're a witness to a crime or you're reporting a crime or something, we're not going to inquire about your immigration status in your interactions with us. So you can still access those resources even if you are undocumented.
Right. MSU police has said that it doesn't question people about specifically their immigration status. And kind of getting to this resource aspect of it all, in past week, MSU sort of announced via an internal email, and now that's been shared to the rest of campus, just what are those resources available to particularly, anyone, but specifically undocumented students or faculty or even staff. Some of that includes, ASMSU or the College of Law. They both offer certain legal services. The College of Law runs an immigration law clinic that people can access. And then there's also...
ASMSU has its student legal services, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. And then there's certain, they also make clear that, for example, FERPA, right, which protects students' privacy, the university isn't able to share that sort of thing unless they're provided with a sort of legal warrant or something that would sort of force them to share that information.
Even with an ICE inquiry, MSU would rely on FERPA to not give out student info unless there's some sort of warrant overriding it.
Exactly. They would kind of point to that first, and then unless shown a warrant, then they would have to comply.
I mean, sharing this guidance almost seems to represent, in the same way that we talked about this doubling down on DEI, MSU maybe is less empowered in this area because like the federal government doesn't have some sort of like law enforcement remedy to DEI, but with undocumented students, I mean, it feels like kind of, again, MSU is saying like, yes, like the federal government would like us to operate differently, but here are the ways that we can still operate the way we want to operate amid these threats, which I think is interesting.
Right.
Yeah, and when like we said, when you've got MSU's president talking about, you know, our international students and scholars bring so much to our cultural tapestry here, and then sort of see the link there to sharing this kind of thorough guidance about how MSU can sort of, in a sense, protect people unless they're really legally forced to.
Do you feel like that reference in his remarks at the board meeting was a reference to this immigration stuff, the idea that he would like open the meeting by saying how much international students are bringing to MSU?
I mean, I don't want to go so far as to say that that's what he was thinking, but I certainly, I am confident in saying that I see a link there between these things.
And then what about, Emilio, let's shift now. We've talked about the way that MSU is sort of like bucking these federal trends, right? Tell me about, we're going to get into these constituencies that MSU has long dealt with here at home. Sanjay Gupta. We've talked about him on the 1909. He was the dean of the Broad College. Very successful in moving the Broad College up in the rankings. He courted one of the biggest donations in MSU history, was a big part of the 2014 Capitol campaign. And then he's ousted by then the provost. She shortly after became the interim president because he does not report sexual misconduct by one of his professors at this Broad event. And he's a mandatory reporter. He failed that obligation. And he had a lot of supporters who said that that was unfair. That was a disproportionate firing, basically, that he should have just gotten some training or a slap on the wrist. He shouldn't have been fired for it. He files this lawsuit against MSU saying that this is all this like succession plot where Woodruff, the provost, fired him for the mandatory reporting failure because she was scared he would be the next president instead of her. And this has now become this years-long fight with people yelling at board meetings and a lawsuit and all sorts of that. You wrote this week, Gupta thing is resolved. Kevin Guskowitz has sort of ended this in a way. What is the resolution to this fight between this controversial former dean and MSU's administration and board?
Right. So, you know, two things happened last week, right? One is, you're right, the settlement of this lawsuit that had been going on for 2 years. And then simultaneously, right, Kevin Guskowitz announced the sort of, Gupta would be leading or co-leading this new initiative he calls the Green and White Council, which is sort of like a business council meant to help Michigan State meet Michigan's workforce demands going into the future. And so, you know, what we come to figure out is that Gupta coming to lead this council is actually one of the terms of the settlement of this lawsuit.
And to be clear, we haven't seen the full settlement yet. We're still waiting on that through a public records request.
Yeah, but it was confirmed to me via a university spokesperson that that was something included in the settlement.
Yeah.
And so Gupta now is going to, you know, get to lead this council alongside a former executive from Bank of America. And again, it's a little unclear as to what the council will exactly be doing, but he's being given, you know, after being ousted right from his dean position, now being given a new leadership position within the university.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, this was widely announced. We all got the press release, and they, you know, a lot of media covered it of like this new MSU Business Council is going to be led by Sanjay Gupta. It makes no reference of, or at least the press release doesn't make any reference to, you know, why he was ousted from MSU a couple years ago. So it's interesting, kind of like welcome back into the fold with this settlement and given this, I mean, I don't know how much this post really means atop this council. I guess we'll see whether it's just kind of a thing that's there, whether it's a thing that really does a lot of work and has great influence. But it's certainly a concession to someone who was, you know, ousted a couple years ago and has a lot of supporters here on this campus.
Emilio, can you tell me, are these leaders of the Green and White Council, are they paid?
I actually don't know if they're paid right now.
Alex, you know?
I think it's just an advisory council. I can't imagine that there's a compensation. But again, I mean, we're waiting on the full terms of the settlement.
Yeah.
Maybe in addition to this, there's some sort of compensation to him, like just like a dollar amount of a settlement. I know previously he said he's not interested in money. I think at one point it was people were saying he needs to be dean again, and that's the only way they'd settle it. But obviously, I mean, Broad selected a new dean through like an open search or a closed search process earlier this year or late last year. So that's not really on the table. But it's interesting, you know, it's kind of like another one of these very precarious issues MSU's been dealing with for years. This seems to be putting a bow on it and kind of tying it up at this point. Yeah. And then Owen, I want you to tell me about, in addition to this deal with Sanjay Gupta, another sort of deal was struck last week with divestment protesters. This is a constituency that MSU has been dealing with for more than a year now, kind of continually protest, deal falls apart, protest, deal.
Yeah.
We're at another phase of this. But again, this is another one of these issues that MSU has walked a very careful line on. You and I have written pretty extensively about it.
Yeah.
Tell me about, give us the briefest rundown you can on the year or so of divestment stuff that's come before. And then tell me about, what is this new phase, this new deal? What happened on Friday at this meeting that prompted this shift?
Yeah, so you're right. There's been kind of a long back and forth that I think as time has gone on, it's become increasingly clear that MSU is not going to divest. And I think they've, at this point, taken a pretty firm stance
To be
there.
clear, this is the divestment issue we've talked about extensively with an Israeli bond, weapons manufacturers, students upset about the conflict in Gaza and feeling as if MSU is sort of a part of Israel's actions there.
Right, exactly. And of course, what you're saying there, that argument has been kind of countered by MSU in lots of ways, saying the way that the money is flowing is so that now we're just getting repaid basically. And so our money's not actively going toward Israel.
This is the argument that this very old bond, if anything, money is flowing from Israel to MSU, paying it back, not the other way around.
Yeah, that's what MSU's presented.
But I guess it's a broader concern about these weapons manufacturing investments as well that they take in sort of an ethical issue with.
Yeah, and I think just any connection, any financial connection to Israel is kind of raising concerns for this constituency. But yes, MSU has definitely said that the way the money is flowing isn't like we're profiting from Israel's war or anything like that. MSU's also kind of said with these weapons manufacturers, for example, a lot of that stuff is wrapped up in these sort of pools that MSU sort of their investment advisors sort of have control over these things, and these are stock indexes where things are coming in and out on a daily basis. And MSU, because there's contracts here with their people who make the investment advisors and stuff, MSU can't just say, hey, stop that, or they might have a breach of contract situation.
Well, and that's sort of been the debate for a year, right? Is that these activists say you need to divest from this and this and this.
Yeah.
And MSU says, well, it's part of this complicated portfolio that's managed by these outside people we hire. We can't exactly choose everything we're invested in and divest from anything at any given moment.
Yeah.
And this has played out in a series of protests, and then they'll schedule these sit-down meetings between activists and university leaders. The university leaders will listen to them at these meetings, but the activists will feel like there's not enough action. So then there's more protests and then another meeting. And that's sort of the cycle that we've seen.
Exactly.
You and I wrote in December that it felt like that dynamic was going to change, that balance was going to break.
Yeah.
Because the protesters were threatening oh, we're done with meetings. No more meetings. It's all about disruption now.
Right.
And MSU too is signaling at the hardest it ever had, we are not going to meet these demands.
Yeah.
At this board meeting this week, we sort of saw that play out for the first time.
Yeah.
Is it totally different? Is the meetings thing done?
So no, we're kind of back to meetings. It started out
Meetings
as
are back already.
Meetings are back. It started out as a disruption, and so we spoke earlier at the top of the episode about President Guskiwitz's speech, kind of addressing DEI concerns right at the start. A couple minutes into that, I'd say when he kind of started to shift away from DEI. Just broader talking about the happenings at MSU, that's the moment when the audience was already sort of all flooded full with people from this pro-divestment constituency. And a couple minutes into the speech is when the first person sort of stood up and they said, "Why did you arrest me?" And they were referencing back a couple months ago at a board meeting. There was a sort of sit-in protest at the administration building. This was another one of these, I guess, sort of more aggressive strategies here was the sit-in protest. And it was a group of 5 people who basically decided to stay there even after the building was going to close. And they were arrested. And that was sort of understood, I think, before, there wasn't they knew that they were intentionally going to sort of stay there until the building closed to sort of make this statement. But so this person stands up and says, "Why did you arrest me?" And then there's this interesting sort of orchestrated pattern where people were standing up. And President Guskiewicz is at first sort of trying to ignore this. He's keeping his head down. He's kind of pausing briefly and then continuing with his speech. There's no police presence or anything like that. But, people keep standing up and sort of reading a short statement criticizing MSU for their inaction on this divestment stuff. And then they sit back down and someone else pops up. And then at a certain point, the board secretary sort of says, "Hey, we need to get there's public comment. We have that baked into our meetings for a reason. We need to get through our business. And if these disruptions don't stop, we're going to adjourn the meeting, reconvene on Zoom on a video call in 10 minutes, and we're going to axe public comment. Right. And so he had said that kind of from the start of at the start of the meeting before it even started. And he said that at other meetings as well.
And they've done that before, where they've
Yes.
moved the meeting to Zoom.
Over the summer. Yeah, that happened. And so basically, at that point, all these protesters kind of launch into a song, and there's all sort of chorusing and making
Use
it.
that verb, chorusing, in your story.
I did,
I
I
thought
did.
that was. I haven't heard chorus as a verb before.
Yeah, I mean, at first we kind of had sang, and I was like, they chorused. I just thought it was a stronger verb. It was a chorus. And so anyway, basically, the board at that point has sort of seen from the protesters this kind of clear stance that they were here to disrupt this meeting, right? And so,
And I mean, that's what they said they were going to do 2 nights before, right?
Yeah.
Because they hold this like town hall,
Yes.
where they wanted the board to come and listen to them. Nobody from the board showed up.
Yeah.
And they said, all right, well, we're going to, go to your meeting Friday and watch out for what we're going to do. And it seems like this is what they were planning, was to disrupt it.
exactly, yeah. There was a lot of frustration there because with that town hall, the organizers sort of said that 4 board members had said to them, had given verbal commitments that they were going to show up, and then they didn't. And so, yeah, this was kind of the reaction away is, okay, if you guys aren't going to come to our thing, we're going to sort of crash your party here.
And they do crash the party, right? I mean, the meeting was adjourned for half an hour, right?
Yeah, the meeting was, it was delayed for about 30 hours. They adjourned it. Most of the
30
board-
hours, Owen.
30 hours? I'm so sorry. It was not that long. That would be a little bit ridiculous. 30 minutes, thank you. The board and the president start to sort of file out of the room.
Yeah.
But interestingly, a couple trustees, Rima Vassar, Dennis Deno, and a new trustee, Mike Balo, they all...
These are the 3 that have sort of, in certain moments, voiced a little bit of support for, I mean, never materially, but like sort of vaguely supported this movement.
Yeah, for sure. And I think with Mike Balo, I think it's sort of, for him, tied to, rather than an ideological thing, I think it's just sort of tied to a larger idea of being responsive to constituents and transparency and good governance. It sort of
Yeah, I mean,
seems-
this guy, he's like a conservative Republican.
Yes.
I don't know if he's on it with the Israel demands, but he's very into sort of disruption. And I mean, for years, he was the guy disrupting the board meetings.
Yeah, exactly.
And just now he's been voted onto the board. So maybe he sees a sort of affinity there.
Exactly. And so anyway, these 3 board members are sort of huddled over in the corner talking to the board secretaries, maybe sort of charting out a next move for them. And what they decide to do is come back and take their seats, even though the meeting's adjourned. And then they basically engage in a back and forth conversation with the protesters. And it's pretty heated for a moment. Rima Vassar, in fact, I think matches some of the heatedness and says, hey, we want to work with you, but you need to let us do our business, right? And then eventually President Guskiewicz sort of comes back in the room along with board chair Kelly Tebay. And then the last person to kind of come back is Breonna Scott. So that leaves Renee Kanaki Jefferson, Rebecca Bahar Cook, and help me out. Sandy Pierce.
Well, and Pierce and Bahar Cook are probably the most vocally anti-divestment.
Exactly.
Of the board.
Right. And so they never came back in the room, but basically for about 30 minutes, they sort of went back and forth and kind of worked out these grievances. Why didn't you show up to our town hall? Well, it's because we all have different jobs, and it's hard for us to all meet, but we're all in town kind of for the board meetings, and so that's when we need to have these things. But what the president said is sort of that they never committed to this formally, and so they're kind of working out those grievances, and then they basically chart a path forward. And what they land on is, okay, we can meet the day before the next board meeting, which is going to be April 10th. And that can be our proper discussion with all the board there and the president, and we can hear about your divestment concerns. But within 2 weeks, we need to have a preliminary meeting to sort of set the terms for that meeting. And sort of make it a sort of structured thing, maybe agree on a mediator. And that sort of follows the model of a meeting that apparently MSU's leaders had just before this board meeting with the Black Students Alliance, where the leaders said, hey, we just had this really productive meeting with BSA. And President Guskiewicz actually said to the pro-Palestinian demonstrators, you guys should get in touch with BSA and kind of talk to them about how they had the preliminary thing with us where they decided the terms.
Basically talk to BSA about how they deal with us.
Yeah.
Like he would prefer if they,
Yeah, that was kind of the idea. And eventually they say, okay, we'll let your meeting go on if we can agree on that. And they agree. Within 2 weeks, we need to meet over Zoom to decide the terms of our meeting. And then the meeting actually has to happen on April 10th where we can where we can present our concerns to you all.
Oh, and tell me, if you want to be sort of broadly cynical about this, either from a pro-Palestinian perspective, you could say, oh, this is another meeting where they're just going to nod their heads, but they're not actually going to do anything. Or if you want to be sort of cynical about this in a way that's critical of the protesters, you could say, like, why do they keep doing these meetings? They know MSU's not going to divest. Just like meeting after meeting, what is the point of this? Do you feel that this is, in like a cynical way, just a furthering of this dynamic that's been going on for a year where nobody gets what they want? Or is this new meeting thing that they're talking about something that's like materially different than what they've been doing for a year, where there might be a different result than all the meetings that have come before?
Yeah, cynically, I don't think this is a new thing.
This is just more of the same.
Yeah, I mean, I guess.
Is the mediator different? They're talking about having like a mediator there. Who would that be, did they say?
No, they didn't get into the specifics there. I do think that, I don't know that there's been like a proper forum with a mediator before. And you know, Board Chair Kelly Tebe said in an interview with me sort of recently, you know, that kind of the status quo with these things hasn't been cutting it. And that kind of what the way it's worked is like one trustee has met with all the protesters and has sort of been talked at, and there's not this room for a back and forth. And that was kind of what MSU's leaders said about why they didn't want the town hall, was they thought this town hall was going to be sort of a PR stunt for protesters to kind of attack the leaders without being able to go back and forth.
I mean, it was sort of designed like you guys are going to come sit and listen, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. And like the promotional materials for it kind of struck that tone. And so I guess you could say, in a less cynical perspective, that this new meeting where it's supposed to be a back and forth and there's not the media there and there's not, it's just meant to be a forum to really get into the nitty gritty here. I guess you could say that's a change, but I guess the cynical perspective though is it going to move the needle? Is it going to create pave the way for the divestment that these people have wanted? I think MSU has made it pretty clear, but I think what President Guskowitz has said is, you know, can we find a sort of compromise, if that's the right word?
Yeah.
Can we find other ways, maybe create some professorships here for Palestinian scholars? Is that something we can do? Which we've seen those sort of deals kind of.
And that's worked. At some schools, protesters have taken a deal where it's like, we're not going to divest, we're not going to change our endowment, but we're going to put something on the table for like taking students who have been displaced from, you know, universities in Gaza, like they can come study here, or a scholarship for international students. That, I mean, when we've talked to activists, they've said that like that's not something they would ever consider as, you know, as alternative to divestment. But it's interesting that they're furthering the meeting dynamic. I mean, I guess just from like a higher ed leadership perspective, it's kind of interesting. You know, we've seen these scenes at like a bunch of other schools, Columbia, even just U of M down the road, where this stuff gets really ugly between schools and protesters. This is another example of like what could have become a very ugly scene at MSU being resolved by, all right, we're going to stop, you know, yelling at each other today. Let's do a meeting in a month.
Yeah.
You know, maybe that's a testament to like Kevin Guskowitz being some sort of incredible president that no one else has figured out how to strike that balance. Maybe the protesters at MSU are just more inclined to take deals that don't really work for their demands.
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly been kind of recognized in the past, like when the encampments were happening, he was sort of recognized as a president with a unique ability to sort of, you know, do the civil discourse and the real.
I mean, it's certainly different than like what we're seeing at a lot of other universities that make national news for just how like violent these scenes can get.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
So, yeah, well, that's all for now. We will be back next week with fresh reporting from the great minds here at the State News. Until then, all the stories we discussed and plenty more are available at statenews.com. Thanks to my guests Owen and Emilio and our podcast coordinator Taylor. But most of all, thank you for listening. For the 1909, I'm Alex Walters.